Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 in our chats with Emily as we are calling our readings through the poetry of Emily Dickinson contained in the Johnson edition. We turn now to one of the most anthologized, talked about, commented upon poems of Emily, poem number 258. There's a certain slant of light. Now, there's so much that we'll need to say in kind of setting up this conversation. Many have said that, and the biographer Sewell comes to mind, that Emily is the specialist as it relates to light. She is the master poet of light. I don't know that there's any other poet that really has followed to ground so much. And the ways in which she plays with Plato's Republic, and of course Republic 7 and the cave allegory. We've given full lectures at LearnStrong.net. Of course, in Plato, the sun and light is usually accorded some kind of special significance of power, of hope, of value. And in Emily, it's often going to be the reverse of that, as we'll see here. Some have seen this in her description of a winter afternoon and her first use of the word despair. And she's going to use it a number of times in her poems, but this will be our first time that we've met this word. And some have seen this as another theodicy. Some have seen Emily, the great impressionist, almost like an impressionist artist playing with words here. Our assumption now is that you've been following our stuff at LearnStrong.net, down that left-hand side, Chats with Emily, our playlist. I'm hopeful that you've already worked through our set of introductory comments. For example, I just used the word theodicy as one of our Big Five, the last of our Big Five. I'm hopeful that you'll be able to hear that information. In this poem, Emily will play games with all five of our Big Five. Epistemology, what you can know. Ontology, who we are. Psychology, the study of the individual mind, its pains, its motivations, and the like. Sociology, notice she'll use this we and us to kind of draw you into this conversation. And then finally, the question of theodicy. Why must there be pain and suffering? Why must there be despair, is her word here. I'm hopeful as well that you've already studied the previous 257 poems. We just finished with 257, Delight is as the flight. And if you have, then you know that this poem actually sits nested, can I use that phrase, inside of a bunch of poems we've already looked at, where although she hasn't used the word despair, she's clearly tried to understand that feeling, that impulse. Now, in many ways, Emily, as has been pointed out by so many scholars, I'm thinking here of Anderson, for example, understands pain and the power of pain, both external and internal. And it's Emily who really argues that internal pain and suffering is probably far greater. Anderson called it, for Emily, the protean condition of despair. Emily once said in a note, a comment to Higginson, who we've spoken about earlier, the change of the seasons, quote, hurt almost like music shifting when it ease us most, end quote. She also said to Higginson, the sudden light on orchards moved her actually to motivate her to write verse in the first place. It's interesting the way that Emily in this poem will join ecstasy and pain. She'll call it the heavenly hurt. And Emily, we're going to say in this, although short poem, she will demand a whole lot of us. And it is in fact this poem, among a handful of others, that led Harold Bloom in the Western Canon to make comments about Emily and the challenge that Emily placed on a scholar like Bloom to try to understand exactly what was happening. And in fact, our motivation in some ways to call this series Chats with Emily is to try to approach Emily from that spirit of what exactly you're saying we don't care so much about. But what are you gesturing at? And that's what we take away so regularly. Let's enjoy this poem. By the way, this is a significantly difficult poem to read out loud. The incantation and the rhythm is a little interesting. There's a certain slant of light, winter afternoons, that oppresses like the heft of cathedral tunes. Heavenly hurt it gives us. We can find no scar, but internal difference where the meanings are. None may teach it. Any, 'tis the seal despair, an imperial affliction sent us of the air. When it comes, the landscape listens. Shadows hold their breath. When it goes, 'tis like the distance on the look of death. The way this poem moves from the physical to the spiritual, and then back to the physical, and then finally to the spiritual and the physical together with, of course, the passing and death. Notice we go from despair to death. Will make this a powerful poem in so many ways. We're going to right away notice that synesthesia, the merging, the bringing together of images such as sight and sound will be the game that she plays right away. Now, when we get to poem 1129, there she'll say, tell the truth, but tell it slant. And we'll come back to this poem and her use of the word slant. Notice her use of the word certain, because so much of this poem is ambiguous. And yet, she uses this word certain to describe the slant of light of a winter afternoon. And of course, we especially, guys, live right where we get to see these winter afternoons as the light is going away, the way that the light will play, for example, in the snow and the gray and all of that. She'll say, this slant of light oppresses, and then she'll use an interesting simile, like the heft of cathedral tunes. Now, this takes us back to our study of poem 183. I've heard an organ talk sometimes in a cathedral aisle, and understood no word it said, yet held my breath the while, and risen up and gone away, a more Berendrin night girl, yet know not what was done to me in that old chapel aisle. It is not altogether clear that Emily was ever actually in a cathedral to hear the music of the cathedral, and yet what does she say? In the same way, notice the word heft here. Notice the H sounds as we'll play it with heavenly hurt a little bit later. What does she say? She says, in the same way that the organ music in a cathedral can kind of oppress me, depress me, hurt me, make me sad, the same is true of a certain kind of slant of light in winter afternoons. Stanza 1. And then she'll, get to the hard part of the poem. And by hard here, I mean challenging as in painful. She calls it heavenly hurt. Notice she'll join ecstasy and pain together. When we get to poem 756, she'll play this game. It's quite remarkable this way. She says, one blessing had I, then the rest so larger to my eyes that I stopped gauging, satisfied for this enchanted size. It was the limit of my dream, the focus of my prayer, a perfect paralyzing bliss, contented as despair. Few poets can play games like that. It's remarkable. A heavenly hurt. It gives us, notice she invites you now into the poem, we can find no scar. In other words, the pains that she's talking about now are not physical pains right on the body, but rather psychic pains. The pains where you can't see the scar. But, notice she calls it, internal difference, where the meanings are. Armand, the great scholar of Emily Dickinson, called this her creative crisis conversion to unbelief. It's a fascinating way to look at this. The quest for meaning, the quest for understanding, the quest to try to figure out what one can know. All of this is, in some ways, we might say, translinguistic. You can't put it in words. She says it this way, none may teach it. It isn't clear if we're talking about here the it being heavenly hurt or light. Could be both. Any, with in between the two dashes, gives at least three different possible interpretations of what it actually she is saying here. That is to say, how is it possible that one can understand this pain that she's going to call in the next line despair? 'Tis the seal, despair, that is to say the wounding, right? Despair. Now, this is her first use of that word, but she's going to use it in 30 poems, all right? We'll see it in other poems to come. And then she'll call it, by the way, this use of her word seal here takes us to our study of Revelation 5 through 8 and the 7 seals. You'll remember of the pain, the misery that's associated with those seals. An imperial affliction. Now, this makes it significant. The heavenly hurt, the imperial affliction. Does this seem to suggest that God visits upon us pain? Is she suggesting it that way? Well, she says it, sent to us of the air. Notice any to air. Again, the question of deity comes to mind. Finally, speaking of when it comes, the final stanza here. When it comes, the slant of light, the heavenly hurt, the pain. And here now she'll engage in what scholars will call the pathetic fallacy. That is to say, that poetic device that will attribute human feelings to nature. When it comes, the landscape listens. You'll remember our study of Milton in Paradise Lost and his borrowing out of the Dutch landscape, that use for the first time in Milton of landscape. And now Emily will pick up on it. We've given full lectures about Milton at learnstrong.net. When it comes, the landscape listens. It's almost as if the earth responds to this certain slant of light. Shadows hold their breath. And of course, the fact that she begins with light and ends with shadows will take any of us that have studied our Plato's Republic, especially Republic 7 in the cave allegory, to understand something's going on. Shadows hold their breath. This notion of anticipation or uncertainty, which is ironic that she uses the word certain at the beginning of the poem. And then when it goes, that is to say the cessation of light, 'tis like, notice another simile, the distance on the look of death. In other words, as a person dies and the light leaves their eyes, there's a certain kind of distancing there. Now, when we get to poem 510, we'll come back to this study. I'm just going to read it for you now. It was not death, for I stood up and all the dead lie down. It was not night, for all the bells put out their tongues for noon. It was not frost, for on my flesh I felt Sansaro's crawl, nor fire, for just my marble feet could feel a chancel cool. And yet it tasted like them all, the figures I have seen, set orderly for burial, reminded me of mine, as if my life were shaven and fitted to a frame and could not breathe without a key. And 'twas like midnight sun, when everything that ticked has stopped, and spaces and space stares all around, or grisly frosts, first autumn morns repeal the beating ground. But most like chaos, stopless, cool, without a chance or spar or even a report of land to justify despair. Again, her use of this word, I think, is significant. Well, what are we going to say at 2A about this poem and what maybe messages it is that she's playing with? Sharon Leitner, the great Emily scholar, has said it this way: our deepest convictions are shaped by subtleties of perception of which we are scarcely aware. That's her reading of this poem. Another scholar has asked maybe that God's divinity is best understood in winter, is her argument. In other words, it is only through pain and suffering that one really begins to understand the question of theodicy and the potentiality of deity. At 2B, the H sounds are interesting here. As we said, her ability to merge, right, two different types of powerful sensations, sight and sound, and then of course the pathetic fallacy, as we were saying, of giving human feelings to things like the landscape and nature. Finally, a number of scholars have pointed out that Thomas Hardy's classic poem, the Darkling Thrush, plays similar kinds of games later, but of course we've given full lectures on this at learnstrong.net. In that poem, the old thrush, the bird, will sing and ultimately give Hardy, the pessimist, the possibility of hope. But you'll remember in that poem, he says that I leant upon a coppice gate when frost was spectre gray, and winter's dregs made desolate the weakening eye of day. And it sounds very similar, but in that poem we'll have, of course, some hope here. There's not a lot of that, right? Not a lot of that. You'll remember a biblical reference, the Lord chastens whom he loves, that Hebrews reference. And there's an interesting idea here as well, that maybe the pain that we all are struggling with is in fact pain that is delivered to us by heaven itself, the heavenly herd. Now it is, I think, interesting that Harold Bloom will take us, as he always loved his Wallace Stevens, to the poems of our climate. And let's finish our study here with a reading of that. Clear water in a brilliant bowl, pink and white carnations. The light in the room were like a snowy air reflecting snow. A newly fallen snow at the end of winter when afternoons return. Pink and white carnations. One desires so much more than that. The day itself is simplified, a bowl of white, cold, a cold porcelain, low and round, with nothing more than the carnations there. Say even that this complete simplicity stripped one of all one's torments, concealed the evilly compounded vital I, and made it fresh in a world of white, a world of clear white, brilliant edged. Still, one would want more, one would need more than a world of white and snowy sense. There would still remain the never-resting mind, so that one would want to escape, come back to what had been so long composed. The imperfect is our paradise. Note that in this bitterness, delight, since the imperfect is so hot in us, lies in flawed words and stubborn sounds. It is, I think, very possible that Stevens and other poets like Hardy and Eliot are all playing similar kinds of games for us, resurrecting the 3B question of all questions. And it is the theodicy question, isn't it? It's the question, of course, of Job. It's the question of all theodicies. How do you deal with what Emily calls despair? It is the penultimate question. I hope that your study of Emily is helping you deal with it. Thank you.